Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone for committing time on this wonderful Thursday morning, at least here. I don't know what time it is elsewhere, but it's great to see you all. So I speak really quickly, which is great because more speed means more Talmud. In a relatively short amount of time. What I'm going to ask is if people have questions, I would love for this to be as participatory as possible. I don't know if people are able to unmute themselves or if it's easier for people.
They cannot currently, but we could change that. Generally, we don't do that because of background noise and stuff like that. But we can mix it up. I'm open to that.
So maybe we'll start off using the chat as a place for people to pin their questions or their comments. I can see that over on the right side of my screen. And if that seems like it's becoming a little cumbersome, then maybe we can experiment with unmuting people. But for now, I'm happy to go with the chat. So if you have comments, if you have thoughts, if you have questions as we are speaking, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will try and give people a shout out and respond to those. So to start off with, we are in Tractate Ketubot, not quite in the middle. We still got a ways to go till we get to that point. But we are working our way through a section where we're trying to figure out who is a credible witness about a particular subject and who is not credible when it comes to a particular subject. There's a lot in here about who is credible to say that they are in fact descended from the priesthood, who is not credible to say things in that way. And so today what we're going to do is we are going to do a little bit of an exploration around one particular example of how this is playing out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste the link to where we are here in the chat. So if people want to follow along in Safari, I'm happy to do that. What I'm also going to do is I'm also going to share my screen. So if people want to follow along visually there, I'm happy to do that. So let me do screen share and 1 second. Here we are. Okay. So yeah, so people can take a look. So I want to kind of first, before we dive into the Talmud, I know there's lots of exciting things that go on in the Talmud. I want to give a little bit of context. So from not just kind of like a Jewish legal standpoint, but from a broader common law standpoint, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that most of us are from common law countries. That is to say, the United States, or England, or from kind of Anglophone Canada. So I'm going to kind of raise a couple things that happen in these common law legal systems around testimony. So one of the beautiful things about that's incredibly complicated, I don't know if we have any lawyers who are out there in the crowd, but there is a really complicated concept called hearsay. And hearsay is whenever you watch any kind of, yes, Quebec is civil law. Thank you for pointing that out, Pepita. Quebec has its own kind of more French-oriented legal style. If you're in Ontario, which is where I am, or most of the rest of Canada, you'll have a common law system. And so which kind of a lot of common law systems share each other's approaches to things and can find each other's takes persuasive. Quebec has, yes, I am not as familiar with Quebec. I wanted to try and keep to the area that I was more familiar with. So having been trained as a lawyer in the US, this is something I know. I would be curious to hear more about how this, on issues like this might play out there, though. I'm gonna have to take a look at that and make a note. There is this idea about hearsay, and if you watch any kind of TV dramas around, courtroom dramas, that the lawyers will often say, objection, hearsay. And hearsay is basically if the witness is going to be testifying and saying, I heard so-and-so say that they were in this place or that they did this thing. And if it's just you're testifying what you heard someone say, in general, that's not going to be permitted if you're trying to establish that the truth of what that person said. We don't really need to deal with that because what's really important here is the exception to the hearsay rule, that there is this under kind of federal rules of US federal rules of evidence, there is this, I'm going to paste kind of the summary here because it could be helpful for those who are visual learners. There's this idea that if someone says something that is contrary to their own interest, then you can testify about what that person said. So if a person said, for example, that they were in an automobile accident, let's say, and the person says, outside of court in a completely different context, I was speeding before that accident, or I wasn't paying attention, I was texting on my phone. Then someone who heard that person make that statement under certain conditions that we see kind of in this summary, under certain conditions, someone can say, after the accident, I heard that person say that they were speeding. And that can be used as evidence that that person was at fault. Because it's against their own interests. And so here what we have is we have this situation that's actually kind of similar. And so I'm going to ask us if we want to turn our attention to the Talmud at this point. So we start off with this piece of Mishnah. And so I'll just kind of read this out loud. In a case where witnesses testify that there are two women who were taken captive, with all of the things that might imply when someone is taken captive. And this woman, so we have the first woman, says, I was taken captive, but I am pure. And that woman, the second woman, says, I was taken captive, but I am pure. They are not deemed credible. So what does that mean? It means that each woman testifying and saying, I am, I survived my captivity without any kind of, without being a survivor of sexual assault, is what's implied. Each woman cannot testify to her own status. And then the Mishnah goes on to say, and when this woman testifies about that woman that she is pure and vice versa, they are deemed credible. So what does this say? Let's break this down a little bit. Also acknowledging the fact that typically in Jewish law, there are limitations on when a woman's testimony is admissible. There are limitations on when a woman can serve as a witness in a legal proceeding. So here we're carving out kind of an exception to that. So let's break it down. Basically, if you're sharing positively about yourself, that is not permitted. If you are sharing positively about someone else, that is acceptable, and that can be admitted into evidence, and your testimony is legitimate. So if we're kind of dividing this into a chart in terms of what does this include and what does this leave out? It includes positive testimony about yourself and positive testimony about someone else. What does this leave out? It leaves out negative testimony about yourself. It leaves out negative testimony of someone else, and the impacts of what can happen in those contexts. So it does not include if I say, I was taken captive and I am not pure. It does not address, I was taken captive, she was taken captive, she is not pure. And it also doesn't deal with kind of the cross influences as we're about to get into. So if I say I am pure and that person is, and she is not, that does not address those situations. Or if I say I am impure and she is pure, again, it is a very limited window that the Mishnah is providing us. The only two situations it's talking about is if I'm saying positive things about myself, or if I am saying positive things about my counterpart. So now we get into the Gemara, because what we know about the Gemara always makes things a little bit more complicated, which is kind of an adventure in and of itself. And so what does the Gemara say? The Gemara says, the sages taught in the Tosefta. So the Tosefta, for those who don't know, is this body of material basically that didn't make it into the Mishnah. So we have the Mishnah, which was compiled around 200. We have the Talmud that was compiled around the year 500. And the Tosefta was all the stuff that did not make it into the Mishnah around 200. So we're talking about material that's around 1,800 years old. It's not quite as authoritative necessarily as the Mishnah, but it still can be very persuasive, and the rabbis like to bring it in pretty frequently. So the sages taught in the Tosefta, if one of the women says, I am tainted and my counterpart is pure, she is deemed credible on both counts. So what does this mean? So let's just take a moment to say, so I am impure, my counterpart is pure. So something negative about me and something positive about my counterpart, about this other woman, that is credible. So that seems to imply oh, that's really nice. And that actually keeps with what we were seeing kind of in these exceptions to hearsay earlier, which is if I say something against my own interests, if I say I am tainted, that is acceptable. And if I was saying nice about someone else, that's great. I'm credible in that regard as well. So the next statement, if she says I am pure and my counterpart is tainted, she is not deemed credible with regard to herself, nor with regard to her counterpart. So what is this saying? It's saying, if I say something nice about myself, that is not credible. If I say something not so supportive of my counterpart, that also is not something that's going to be admissible as testimony. So I think that we can probably see the logic here. It's probably not that hard. If we're saying nice things about ourselves, of course we would say nice things about ourselves. We're self-interested. We want to say nice things about ourselves. We want to say that we are pure. So the rabbis are a little bit skeptical as to the truth of that. However, if we're saying something not nice about someone else, the rabbis want to, I think, kind of be supportive and kind of be skeptical also of labeling someone else as tainted. So we are not going to actually address that, and we're not going to accept that as testimony and as something that's convincing. So if she says, moving along, if she says, I and my counterpart are both tainted, she is deemed credible with regard to herself, but she is not deemed credible with regard to her counterpart. I and my counterpart are both tainted. So again, with regard to the first person, the person who's speaking, there's credibility because it's a statement against interest. It's something that does not benefit the speaker, and therefore there's a sense of, if you're saying that, there must be a reason, and we're going to take that seriously. But if you're trying to cast aspersions on someone else, again, the rabbis are more skeptical of that being the case. So finally, if she says, I and my counterpart are both pure, she's deemed credible with regard to her counterpart, but she is not deemed credible with regard to herself. So again, there's that self-interest that's creeping in. And so the idea is, if you're saying nice things about yourself, if you're saying good things like that you yourself are pure, rabbis are skeptical. But when it comes to credibility, in terms of saying positive things about a counterpart, that is something that the rabbis will accept. So again, if we go back to this chart, if we kind of like across the top have what I am saying about myself, and we have kind of pure, not pure. And then on the left-hand side of the chart, we have pure, not pure about saying about the other person. What we'll see is actually very consistent, regardless of how these two things interact. That if you are saying something positive about yourself, the rabbis are going to be skeptical. If you are saying something negative about yourself, the rabbis are going to give you, they're actually going to treat you seriously, which isn't so helpful necessarily, but it's understandable. The idea is, of course, you're going to say something nice about yourself, but if you say something to your own detriment, that's something that the rabbis are going to say, that stands out and that makes sense. However, the rabbis are more skeptical when people say damaging things about their counterparts, so that a woman's testimony would not be admissible if she is saying something critical, something saying that her counterpart is impure. The woman's testimony is only acceptable if if the testimony is saying something constructive or positive or supportive around her counterpart. So we move a little bit down and we continue diving in here. So the master said in the Baraita, that if she says, I am pure and my counterpart is tainted, she is not deemed credible. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? So this seems a little bit strange. Let's dive in a little bit more deeply in terms of why that might be the case. If there are no witnesses that she was taken captive, why is she not deemed credible? Does this apply only to female witnesses or males as well? Great question, Cecile. Because male witnesses in general are taken as credible under Jewish law as the Talmud see it, they're talking here specifically about women's testimony. That the default is, we're not so keen on women serving as witnesses. However, this is actually an exception to that rule. So what we're talking about here is specifically with regard to women, and I would say it's specifically with regard to this particular situation. A situation where a woman is, or two women as the case may be, are taken captive, and there's uncertainty in terms of what exactly happened to them when they were taken captive. And in fact, we're going to get into that right now. So what are the circumstances? So we have a person who says, I'm going to say something positive about myself. I'm going to say something negative about my counterpart. I am pure and my counterpart is tainted. The person is not deemed credible. So we heard about that earlier. Because you're seeking to advance your own interests and casting aspersions on your counterpart. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If there are no witnesses that she was taken captive, why is she not deemed credible with regard to herself? It's a fair question, so we're going to get to that in a second. So if she's saying, I was taken captive and I am pure, she's deemed credible on the principle that the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted. So we're going to get to that one in a second, because I want to come back to that. Rather, it is obvious that there are witnesses that she was taken captive. There's a whole lot to unpack in this paragraph. So let's dive in. So what are the circumstances? If there are no witnesses, why is she not deemed credible with regard to herself? What we have here is an analysis of the phrase, there's kind of this aphorism in the law, which is the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted. So what this legal principle, which again is not exclusive to Jewish law, not exclusive to the Talmud, basically says, if someone says something negative, but then they say something positive, something helpful, then basically that person has more credibility. So Rabbi Axel writes that the penalty of being impure in this case means probably destitution for her. So she would automatically say what's necessary to save her well-being. That is completely correct. I think that I appreciate you pointing that out. These are pretty serious circumstances. This is a circumstance where a woman has been taken captive under unknown circumstances. The Talmud isn't specific to that. And yeah, the consequences could be very, very severe for the woman. And so of course she's motivated to say positive things about herself. And so here when we kind of think about the idea of this concept, the idea that the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted. So if what the commentary is kind of implying is that we're adding kind of basically another factor into the mix. That before we were talking about, are you pure or are you not pure? And when we had our chart, it was actually relatively easy. There were only two options. If we could add a third dimension to that chart, we also have the statement, I was taken captive. And so if we have this principle that the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted. So we have a woman who says, I was taken captive, which has certain very negative implications and could lead to some prohibitions. And if we're getting into what Rabbi Axelrod was talking about, the idea that assuming a person is taken captive, there could be the presumption that the person was sexually violated, sexually assaulted. But here what we have is if we invoke the principle, the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted, then we have this woman who's saying, I was taken captive, so saying something negative, there's a prohibition that is implied there, and I am pure. So the same person who is saying something negative is then also saying something positive and testifying to her own credibility. So if we were to apply that principle, then we would think that she could testify credibly as to her own purity. However, that's not what happens here. So the Gemara is a little bit confused, and that is understandable. So what the Gemara says in order to try and explain this is, rather, it is obvious that there are witnesses that she was taken captive. So what does that mean? What it means is that in order for this principle, the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted to apply, there actually has to be the mouth that prohibited. That is to say, the person actually has to say something to their own detriment. And if they actually don't do that, then there is no permission that mouth can utter. Is this the principle the same thing as migo? It's very similar, Carol. So migo is this principle that I think it appeared sometime in the past week or so. And there's the idea that you could go even further in saying something negative. So if trying to think of like a good example. So if someone says you were speeding and you were doing 75 kilometers in a 50 kilometer an hour traffic zone, and you say, that's not true, I was only doing 60. So you're admitting to some sort of violation, but you're not admitting to the thing that is even worse, namely doing 75 kilometers an hour in the zone. So what Migo says, if you admit to something that's bad but not awful, you are believed to have done the bad but not awful thing, because otherwise you would be doing something worse. And it can also be applied on the flip side. Do the rabbis understand that Connors use the mouth? Yes, they do. I think that they do, that there are other times where this principle is criticized. So I would hope that the rabbis who live in the world that we do. Yes, thank you. There was actually a really good, I appreciate the citation because it was a really good and helpful analysis of Migo. But I would like to think, Aaron, that the rabbis do appreciate the real world implications of some of these things. I think that a lot of these principles legally open themselves up to exploitation, and that's an unfortunate truth of all of these different things. So yes. So just kind of getting back to our page. So this is, there's similarity to Migo in the sense of I'm saying something negative and I'm kind of walking it back to a certain extent. So there is this sense of something negative and something positive that can come out of that. And so here what the Talmud is saying is that if other people witnessed this woman being taken captive, then the admission that she is making to her own detriment, namely that she was taken captive, is not any kind of admission. It's something that is already established. And as a result, she doesn't effectively get credit for her assertion that she is pure. Now, the rabbis are clearly adding additional circumstances onto what the Mishnah and the Baraita, the Tosefta says in the paragraph before, but I think that they're trying to make this square. They're trying to figure out how this might make sense. So then we have the middle clause in the Baraita. So if we want to go back just to kind of like what the Tosefta said, is the first is, and hopefully people can see what I'm highlighting here. There are three statements. The first is, if one of the women says, I'm tainted, my counterpart is pure, she is deemed credible on both counts. So then the next statement is, if she says, I am pure and my counterpart is tainted, she is not deemed credible with regard to herself, nor with regard to her counterpart. And then we have, if she says, I and my counterpart are both tainted, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then we have kind of this, this fourth clause here. So what did we do? So when we were talking about this here in this section, what we're talking about is this statement here. So if I am pure and my counterpart is tainted. So that was the first one we dealt with. So next, we want to dive into what's going on here. If she says, I and my counterpart are both tainted, she is deemed credible with regard to herself, but she's not deemed credible with regard to her counterpart. And so the rabbis want to dive a little bit into that in terms of trying to figure out what's going on. So let's figure that out. The Gemara asks, if so, say the middle clause of the Baraita, if she says, I and my counterpart are both tainted, she is deemed credible with regard to herself, but she is not deemed credible with regard to her counterpart. And if there are witnesses, why is she not deemed credible with regard to her counterpart? Once there is testimony that she is taken captive, she no longer has the presumptive status of purity. Rather, it is obvious that there are no witnesses that she was taken captive, and therefore her presumptive status of purity is intact. So let's go back to trying figuring this out. The basic idea is that she basically is not adding anything into the conversation. Trying to think of how to explain this in a positive way. Basically what they're trying to establish here is the legitimacy of what this woman's testimony is. So again, we come back to the fact that that once her own purity is in question, then her credibility as a witness in this regard is no longer, that she's no longer a credible witness, and she cannot testify as to her counterpart's status, in essence. So then we move on to the last clause. We have about 4 minutes left. I'll see if I can get through this. The Gemara asks, if so, say the last clause of the Baraita. If she says, I and my counterpart are both pure, she's been credible with regard to her counterpart, but she's not deemed credible with regard to herself? And if there are no witnesses that they were taken captive, why is she not deemed credible with regard to herself? Rather, it's obvious that there are no witnesses. So, here we do not again have the statement about being taken captive. That the statement is solely about what their status is in terms of purity. So what the Gemara is really trying to figure out is why would that be the case? So we already know that someone is very there can be kind of motivation to say positive things about yourself. What they're saying is that there are no other witnesses who can testify as to her having been taken captive, and as a result, that this principle of the mouth that prohibited is the mouth that permitted, that does not apply here, because she isn't saying anything that isn't already known. There's nothing else that is going on, and so because there are no witnesses to what has happened to them, or the fact that they've been taken prisoner and taken captive. If obvious, there are no witnesses, then why is her purity deemed intact? That I think is actually part of the real challenge here. That if she can't testify to her own purity, then how is she able to testify with regard to her counterpart? And so I think that the issue here is, I think that we get into this a little bit below. We're not gonna have time to do that. It sounds like these recent DOPs are really guidelines for judges rather than instructions or laws for the community. Yes, I think that, Aaron, you are correct, that these are instructions for when is certain testimony going to be permitted. So those who are familiar with kind of current legal systems, this particular part of ketubot, the part that we're dealing with now, these are in essence rules of evidence, that these are not necessarily about ketubot at all. At this point, you're probably familiar with the fact that the Talmud can be a bit meandering, and so it can be a little bit confusing in terms of what the topic has to do with what we're actually discussing. And here, we're actually talking about rules of evidence. We are not talking specifically about ketubot, and we're not actually necessarily talking exclusively about marriage, even though this is related. We only have one more minute, and so I don't know that we're gonna be able to get to a quick answer of your question.
Rabbi Goren, we never are able to cover it all. That is
I'm
the nature
sorry.
of Talmud. That is the nature of the system. We try and do a little bit all the time, and it adds up to more and more. I think you've raised a lot of really interesting things for us to think about today. Aaron's comment that these passages really highlight, perhaps more than other passages, that the Talmud is really an expert text by and for experts. And in that way, some ways, Daf Yomi is totally counter to the whole purpose of Talmud, which is experts talking about expert judicial things. It's not actually meant for all of us who are not experts to be studying. And yet, I think that's a part of what makes Daf Yomi study, and in this context and other contexts, in the worldwide context, really exciting. And I think also one thing that you're really helping us highlight this week that's interesting is for all of Seder Moed, we see the rabbis dealing with laws that are really specific to the Jewish people because they're about ritual. But now as we move, and even Yevamot to a certain extent, because how many ancient peoples had levirate marriage? I don't know, but I don't think very many. I don't actually know the answer. If somebody knows better than me, please do share. But now as we move into ketubot and laws of marriage, they're dealing with legal issues that are relevant in any society. And then the possibilities for comparison to other legal systems become especially interesting. And that's one reason your voice in this, because I don't know if everyone knows, but Rabbi Goren is also a lawyer, is really helpful for us to see that. So thank you for moving us carefully through this page and letting us see how some of this conversation is put together and the issues that are raised. And there's always more to discuss, absolutely. Is there anything else you wanted? I sort of jumped in and with a whole conclusion here, but is there anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up for the day?
I don't think so. Thank you so much for your time, and wishing everyone a good rest of the week.